Okay, students, so for this assignment, I really recommend toning your ground with a stain. So in other words, just putting a very thin coat of color on, letting it dry, and then working on top of that. Here's one that I already did in acrylic, and it dried pretty quickly. If nothing's different than what I taught you before. Basically, if you use acrylic, you just water it down, spread it around, let it dry for a couple hours, and it should be plenty fine. And that's plenty stained and substantial. What I showed you with the oils last time, the trick of just dabbing it on and rubbing it around with thinner, such as your Gamsol, that works. It's kind of a trick. It's a cheap and dirty way of doing it. The only issue with that is you get sort of flimsy coat, and that's fine if you encapsulate that with layers of other paint. However, you may not like the fact that it comes off so easily at first. And so if you want something that sticks harder and stays more permanent, then this is what I recommend doing. So what I'm using now is basically a combination of a little bit of Galkyd and a very little bit of Gamsol to give me a very fluid and sort of thin layer, a very fluid and kind of thin layer of medium. So I'm actually using this product. It's called a Galkyd Slow Dry. You can see it's much more fluid and lighter in color. It's essentially these two things mixed. This is much more syrupy and whatever. You could just use straight Galkyd. However, I don't know, I just like the fluidity of this, and you may find that this works good for you for painting. Now it does say slow dry, but I think if you put it on in thin enough layers, it should dry relatively, within a day. This always takes a little bit of planning, especially oil painters. You might want to realize that you want to get a little bit of a head start, maybe prep your canvases ahead of time, and that way the next day you can go ahead and start painting on them. So what I've done is I'm going to do this one in burnt sienna. Yellow ochre is a great color. It's very traditional. This one's probably Indian yellow, but they're very similar. And burnt sienna is another great ground color to stain. In fact, this is probably one of the most traditional. I went ahead and put my medium in the cup. Got just my cheap brush, and I'm kind of just taking a little bit of this stuff and mixing it up on here. Just pushing it around. It doesn't have to be that dark. Really, you're just creating kind of a thin stain. Watch for little hairs that come off. These cheap brushes are notorious for losing hairs or bristles. And my suggestion is to also go in both directions. This will help alleviate any possible, I don't know, brush marks that might get in your way. You kind of go both ways. Okay. And that should do it. So I'm just gonna set this aside, wash my brush, and this should be ready. It should be ready by tomorrow. Touch it with your finger if you're not sure. Okay, and then the next thing you're gonna wanna be able to do is make sure you set up a still life that takes into consideration some of those complementary colors. What you decide to do is totally up to you. You could play around with some combinations that you might think work well. I've used this kind of yellowish ochre colored blanket. I've got a red onion that has a lot of purples in it. Those purples seem to complement the yellow and the yellow ochre. And then I have this green ceramic bowl and sort of a deep red apple. They're not perfectly complemented, but they're very close. They're colors that seem to kind of use that combination. And then think about how you might want to set up your canvas. And while you're in this phase too, before you even start painting, I just want you to take an opportunity to really look at the sort of lights that you see in these shadows, this glow in here versus the dark part here. Maybe the red that you see as the light comes through that little piece of the skin of the red onion. It's coming through because it's kind of translucent, so you see red there. You see kind of orangey yellow in here. And let's go a little closer. Notice there's even a green tint to this shadow. It's all cool things to consider. Just try to take note and look at the different colors that you're seeing, because that might inform you on what kind of, I don't know, paints you get out for this assignment. Let's talk about color mixing. And the first thing I want to say is the real trick to learning how to mix color is to experiment. There's really no other way. You have to find what works for you and how you want to set up your palette. I mean, you understand the concept of the color wheel and how to make oranges and whatnot using red and yellow, or purples with blue and red, that sort of idea. And, you know, your job in this assignment, essentially, is trying to match the colors that you see and create those hues. But just for the sake of illustration, I'll try to mix some colors for you and kind of show you how to set up a palette a little bit. Now I have the very basic paints out, the ones that I asked you to get. So what we have is, actually this is zinc white because I couldn't find my titanium. Basically white, burnt sienna, raw umber. This is phthalo blue right here. This one has a little bit more of a green tint. This is quinacridone red. This is ultramarine. And what yellow is this? It is cadmium yellow light. And just for fun, I'm just going to show you, cadmium yellow light is a slightly greenish yellow. If you thin it out pretty smooth on your canvas, I'm sorry, on your palette, you can see it almost has a bit of a yellow tint to it. And that's interesting to note. So just remember that that is a cool yellow. Now, strangely, some of my favorite colors are not on this palette. And it's not because I don't like them. I mean, they're just not necessarily good mixing colors. Like Indian yellow is a glorious yellow. It's very luminescent. It's got kind of a warm color to it, unlike this one that's green, but it's very transparent. And so whenever I try to use it for mixing, it doesn't do the things that I want it to do. So these are good mixing paints. These are good paints that mix well together to give you other tones that you're trying to make. You know, a lot of times as an artist, people really respect your ability to create your own colors. You know, you don't want to paint colors that are straight out of the tube typically, because it just seems a little half done. So back to business. Let's try out a few things, and then I'll talk about a few different tips that I have. So obviously, if I want to make a green, you take blue and some yellow. Now blue is much stronger, you know, has a lot stronger pigment to it. Yellow is easily, you know, corrupted. So I'm going to take a little yellow and put it here. And I'm going to take a little yellow, put it here. And I'm going to show you the difference between the two blues and what they do. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and do some red too. So I'll take a little bit with my palette knife, just make a pile here. So I want to see what kind of colors we can make just using these three. I mean, obviously, red and yellow should make orange, blue and yellow should make green, and same over here. Let's see the differences, and let's see how we can. So I'm going to just take the tiniest amount of this, very little, actually maybe less than that. It's better to start with less. I'm going to add that in. Remember, yellow is very easily corrupted, so you don't want to use too much of the other pigment. If I want it to be a little darker, I'd go ahead and pick up a little more blue. This is an opaque green. It's not very transparent. You can make it transparent by adding lots of medium to it, but the pigments, these particular pigments, are pretty opaque. And of course, you know, I could add more blue to it if I wanted to see. Let's go ahead and do that. Actually, I'll wait. We'll do this one first. Okay, so I have this yellow over here. I'm going to take the tiniest bit. This time we're using ultramarine blue. This one has a little bit more of a blue tint to it. Let me try to spread it out. Hopefully you can see this. If I split it out thin on this white palette, get an idea of kind of what that looks like versus this blue over here. See the difference? Try to get the same amount of thinness so you can see. Yeah, this one has a little bit more of a greenness to it. So let's try to do that. Let's mix a little bit of this in. Whoa, much different. This one has a lot of color still in it, where this one kind of neutralized a little bit. It became a little more natural looking. I want to say a little more, I'm going to add a little more just so they get to be about the same richness of green, same tone of green maybe. All right, do you see the difference? This one is almost more, I want to say artificial, but it's got a lot more color. And this one's grayed out just a little bit. And this is from a strange phenomenon. And it's from the idea that goes back to when we looked at the color wheel and we talked about complementary colors and mixing them together. So let's say you take a yellow and a purple and they're perfect complementaries and you mix them together, they turn to gray, correct? And that's because one's truly, truly warm and the other one's truly, truly cold, and they're opposite each other on the color wheel. Now these aren't opposite each other on the color wheel. They're making a secondary color. But there is a hint of coolness in this. And there's a hint of coolness in this. And since they're both cool versions of those colors, they don't neutralize one another. And so you get a stronger sort of pigment come out. Now that's fine. You know, that's good to know. However, maybe you don't always want something that's that saturated in color. Sometimes you want something that's a little more neutralized. So here I have a warmer blue. This blue is warmer technically than this one. And I mix this warm blue with a cool yellow, and notice how it's neutralized a little bit and became more natural. Very interesting concept and something to think about, because this will work throughout the range of all your mixing. Now, quinacridone red, if I thin it out really very thin, you might notice it's a bit on the cool side. I know you think of red as always being warm, but that's not necessarily true. There's kind of variations within those colors where this red happens to be a little bit cooler than other reds. Okay, kind of starts leaning towards the purple side. I mean, not enough to call it purple, but there's a coolness to it. So let's see what it does when we add it to the cool yellow. I'm just going to use it a little tiny bit again, because remember, yellow is very easy to manipulate. We should get a pretty vibrant orange. Okay. And that's the orange that we get with those two particular colors. If you want to make it a little more on the red side, you know, you just take a little bit more of this, add it in. Okay. Try to get the excess off here so I don't waste it. Now, what other combination can we make? Well, we can make purple. Purple's not one of those colors that you use very often, but however, sometimes. So what I'm going to do is just take a tiny bit of blue. I'm going to use this cool blue. And this, and a good chunk of this red. Yeah, that's much too deep. Now these are cool red and cool blue. Let's see how it looks when I thin it out. Nice. One second. All right, and now I'm gonna try to make a purple using the same red, but this time we're gonna go ahead and use this warm blue. See what happens. And then I'm gonna thin it out so you can kind of see. These look actually pretty similar, strangely. Very, very subtle difference, but you can tell more with the yellow because that makes a bigger deal. I'm gonna go ahead and add some more red back into this. Because let's say if I was doing the still life that we're looking at, right? The one that I used as an example, I'm gonna wanna find some kind of deep tones that are more reddish purple for that red onion. And then maybe some tones that I might use for the apple as well in some of the shadows. So I can make a couple of little versions over here. Some that are a little more red. Purple's starting to take over my palette. Uh-oh. I'm spreading it out to see what it looks like in its thinnest. And then spread this one out versus this one. Well, before I get too carried away with the purple thing, because essentially what I do, I just keep kind of pushing and pulling these. I'd add a little red or a little something or whatever just to change it. Now let's talk about a complementary opposite. So what if I took this purple and added yellow to it? Now this is kind of going to be interesting. Let's see what happens. So I'm going to take this yellow here, and just with that tiny bit of purple that was on my knife, I'm just scraping up hardly anything here. I don't want that much. I'm kind of adding it into the yellow. It's darkening it. It's making it deeper, almost more like a golden color. That's a really interesting phenomenon there. See, like, you know, normally I think the assumption would be like if you add black to yellow, that would be your, let's get this back to more bright. So I'll add more yellow back into it. I guess sometimes the thought would be to add black to a color to make it darker, but black really a lot of times destroys your pigment colors. So avoid that if possible. You really don't even want to have black on your palette unless you really know you're going to absolutely need it for something. Notice how much warmer this is compared to this kind of cool yellow that we started with. It's warmer, and it's used the complementary opposite to deepen it, make it more golden. Okay, now we also have white. White is one of those necessary evils. Sometimes you just need a lighter version of the color that you have. So what can we do? Let's take some white. And of course, just like yellow, white is a very light color. So you're gonna have to add a lot of white to something to make a lighter version. So that was mostly white and just a smattering of that yellow. Let's put a bunch more in. Let's see. So now I've got a lighter version. I say necessary evil. That's kind of a funny way to put it. It's not really a necessary evil. White is actually a really complex color. Well, technically it's not a color, but you know what I mean. It's a pigment that we use in painting, so I'm just going to call it a color, but it's one of those ones that painters over the years, when pigments were harder to come by, white was one of those ones that people were always seeking out the perfect white. They were always trying to get a perfect white. So I'm going to take a little bit of purple, hardly any. See what happens over here. Okay, just a light version of that. Let's do the same to over here. Let's see if we can notice any difference. I'll put my white there, scrape up a little of this. I see the difference now. I don't know if you can in the camera. Hopefully there's enough light here and everything. This is one of those things that maybe seeing it up close might help. But this one is a little bit pinker. It's got a little more of a reddish tint, and this one's a little more of a cool purple. So you can see how these two ended up being slightly different. Again, you know, just sometimes experimenting is the way to figure that out. Here we have some burnt sienna. I'm sorry, I've got a kitty here on the table now. I don't know what to do with her because I tried locking her in her room, but she throws the biggest fit. So burnt sienna is a reddish brown, and it's a very common color to use. Like I said before, this is a color that's good for staining a canvas, and it's a very natural color. So just for fun, let's do this. Let's take a little bit of this green and add a little bit of this reddish brown to it and see what it does. Okay, it makes it a little more natural looking. Careful, kitty, you're gonna get paint on your nose. Watch it. Yeah, it's starting to get a little muddy. But, you know, that's fine. That could be perfect. You might want something like this. You know, more like the tree, like the color of green for trees. It's got a yellowness to it, but it's more natural. Where this looks more like a little bit more like a Kermit the Frog kind of color. It's not the same. Where this is more natural. This is more likely to happen in nature. So just by adding a little bit of this burnt sienna in there, I made something that's might be more to, you know, more in line to what you're trying to make. Again, let's take a little of this burnt sienna. This is raw umber. Burnt umber becomes more like a brown, but raw umber has a much more of a greenish to it. It's still a brown, but a brown in the sense that it's a greenish brown. Now these two colors work magically together if they're done in layers. So in other words, let's say you use burnt sienna to tone your ground and do sort of like an underpainting. And then you glaze this over the dry paint in very thin transparent layers. This looks awesome. It looks like a great color that shadows would look like. And I haven't necessarily mixed the two very often, but let's just for fun mix them and see what happens. This is wet and wet. So instead of like a dry transparent layer over another dry layer, I am now mixing wet paints together to see what kind of variation we get here. Essentially, I'm just making a darker brown. It's probably hard for you to tell, but it's somewhere in between these two. It's, you know, it's more of a kind of a neutral where this one's warm and this one's cool. This one's somewhere in the middle. Okay. Now let's say I wanted this orange and I want it to be redder. Obviously, you add more red to it. You push it in that direction of the color wheel. That's a nice color. I like it. I'm gonna try to separate it here. Running out of space. Okay. Or if maybe I wanted it to be lighter, let's go ahead and try adding some yellow to it. But this time, rather than using this, I think I'm going to pick up from this pile over here. So now I have variations of yellow. I mean orange, rather. So redder, more in the middle, and lighter, more yellow. And we could do that with all of these. I think you get the point. You know, you just keep messing around and kind of pushing colors in different ways. Now there's always that possibility that you make mud. Okay, It happens. Sometimes you just pick two colors that you think that are going to mix well together. For example, earlier today I had some acrylics I was going to goof around with just to kind of see if they would work good for a demo. And I used a transparent Indian yellow, and I mixed it with, I don't know, the blue that was in there, ultramarine. And it basically just turned to kind of like a nasty color. It turned to mud really quickly. It wasn't what I wanted. I love transparent yellow. I love Indian yellow. It doesn't work good for mixing. So, and that just reaffirmed my suspicions. It's not a good mixing color, where this one is. Okay, now these are all the colors that I've asked you to buy. So they're kind of the mandatory colors that you'll need. However, there are a few that I haven't, shown you. And there's a few tricks that I really recommend. Now, one of the colors that I've bought in the past is dioxazine purple. I think at the time, in fact, it has a thing on here from Ellis. It was $8.70 plus whatever, 20% off or whatever he gives you. I'm not sure what it costs now, but I know this is a very old tube of paint. And the reason is because this dioxazine purple is crazy pigment. It's crazy. It's very rich, and it doesn't take very much at all to do anything with it. Let's take a look at what it looks like. It's a much cooler purple. It's very blue. It's very dark, incredibly dark. And, I'm just taking, a sliver of this would really, let's add it to this yellow and see what happens. Really darkens everything a lot. Ooh, now this is one of those instances, but this is almost turned green. Rather than neutralizing, there's enough blue in this that when I add it to this cool yellow, it gives it almost like pukey green color. Kind of gross. But who knows, maybe necessary. Maybe you're painting something with puke green in it. Wonderful. Now, this is a good one to take a note of. I think I mentioned it before, but I am going to tell you again. This is cadmium red light, and don't let the name fool you, even though it says it's red. Cadmium red light is actually a very brilliant orange color. And again, it's one of those paints that's typically a little bit expensive, much more on the expensive side. But there's a reason to that. Again, it's very pigment heavy. The pigment is incredibly, you don't need a lot of this to do much. Now, the beauty of this color is it happens to be almost the perfect complementary opposite to phthalo blue. And that is incredibly useful because it's very rare that you find tubes of paint that happen to be already perfect complementary opposites. So what that means is I can mix this together with some phthalo blue, start with just a little at first, and actually create what's known as like a chromatic black or a tone of gray. And this really comes in handy later in life when you want to start making glazes to make shadows. Oh, I hope I didn't have some yellow in there. And I found this is almost like a universally good glaze color. In your black and white piece, you went ahead and used black to make glazes. And that's fine. You know what I mean? That's fine in your black and white piece, but you don't want to use black to make glazed shadows in the future. When you want to glaze shadows, you want to find something that's chromatic. Whether it has some color in it or not, this one is one of those ones that actually almost becomes gray. Do you see that? It almost has no color to it. It's just gray now. Crazy. And why is that handy? Well, for one, it's chromatic. But two, is that if I want to shift this to the warm side of gray, all I have to do, whoops, put that away, is add a little more of this cadmium red light. Or if I want to shift it towards the blue side, I go ahead and add a little bit more of this phthalo blue, okay? And why would I want to do that? Well, it turns out that when you're glazing colors, it tends to look better if you glaze a cool color on top of a warm. So let's take this piece, for example. If I wanted to glaze a shadow on top of this, whether it was a yellow lemon or yellow, let's just say this is the ground in which my still life sits. Okay, the blanket. And I want to glaze some shadows on there. If I have a touch of blue in it, if it's a touch cooler, and in this case with a little blue in it, it's going to look more natural. If it was more on the warm side, if it has more of a warm tint to the glaze, it's going to look kind of sickly. Warm over warm looks sickly, where cool over warm looks more natural. And why is that? I think that has something to do personally with like the way light just works. Like we talked about in the slide lecture, you have, the light from the sun is warm and therefore casts cool colored shadows. The light from a fluorescent lamp is cool and therefore casts warm shadows like oranges and reds. And so I think that has something to do with it. So I'm gonna just add a little bit of yellow to cadmium red light, which is orange, to this side. Make this one a little bit warmer over here. Okay, trying to get the excess off. Going through a lot of paper towels today. Kitty, thank you. You're being pretty good. Stand out of my way. Good. Ooh, that's too much. Nuts. Okay, so well, I added quite a bit of blue to this one, more than I meant to. So I'll add a little more orange in. I can still make it look gray, but then I'm going to thin it out for you, and hopefully you'll be able to see on camera the difference between the two. We're still trying to make it really neutralized, so it's very much like a chromatic gray. But now just enough of a hint. Oh, this is so subtle. Maybe I went the wrong direction. Oh no, it's still bluish. Good. Crazy thing about mixing paints is sometimes it just takes a dab of anything and it really just changes a lot. Okay, so let me spread it out. Let's see what that looks like. Okay. I'm gonna spread it out this way. Notice how this one has a tiny tinge of blue to it. This might look quite nice being glazed over warm colors. And this one has a tiny tinge of orange to it, almost making it kind of a reddish gray. Can you see the difference between that one and that one? And if this one's still too blue, you could always add a tiny bit more of this. And then when you glaze a shadow, the trick is it's got a lot of medium in it. It's very transparent. You throw it on, you look at it, and if it doesn't look right, wipe it off right away. And then adjust your color accordingly. Because again, that's just where you're very, very subtly changing things. With this assignment though, mostly what you're gonna be doing is messing around in this range of stuff. Playing around with this, trying to figure out what colors work, and then figuring out how to save those colors that you make. So once I start finding a color here, let's say this one's gonna work quite nicely in a lot of those places on my red onion. This is gonna be a great color that I'm gonna use. I'm probably gonna use this. I'll probably use some straight red. I mean, I might add a little bit of yellow to some of this red too, and mess around with versions of red, because there's a lot of colors to see there. But this color I know I'm going to use a lot of probably. It's going to make a lot of the deep shadows and the darker areas on that red onion. So I want to mix enough of this so I have plenty, but then I want to be able to save it. And that's always kind of a trick for painters. So let's talk about that. How do you save your paint? Now, if I had a bunch of little baby food jars, that could work really well. In fact, back when film, regular film photography was a cool thing, those little film canisters worked really well. And that would save your paint for a couple of days at least, if not more. You could put it in there, you could seal them, maybe even stick them in the fridge. That would help, slow the drying time down a little bit. And then when you needed them again, you can take them back out in the next couple of days. Another option is actually to maybe put some saran wrap over the top of this. I know, of course, some of the paint's going to stick to the saran wrap, but I don't know. There's never a perfect solution. Another option is to get some sort of container that works like, this is actually for acrylic paint. So let's see what this does. I'm gonna open it up. It has a couple of cool things. So the lid can act as a palette, just sort of a palette on its own. Move that out of the way. You can buy some acrylic sheets. So this is like sheet paper that you can mix your colors on, and when you're sick of them, you can throw them away, or you can just leave them in there on top of a sponge. I know it seems kind of silly, but acrylic is water soluble, so I could soak this sponge completely. I could lay this acrylic paper on top, put the lid back on, maybe even put a little saran wrap or tape around the seal and stick it in my fridge. And this would actually probably keep my acrylics wet for a long time, which is hard to do because acrylics dry very quickly. In fact, it's trickier than trying to get your oils to stay wet, is saving your acrylic paints. The other option, I think, is to get some really airtight sealable, whether they be baby food jars or something like that. Try to scrounge some of those up so you can save those paints as you make them. Now, I've made very small piles here. That's because this is a demo, and I obviously don't want to just throw all my paint away making a demo. You might want to use a little bit more. You may want to only concentrate on a couple colors at a time. So rather than, you always see the artist, the painter, he's got a palette and he's got dabs of every color on there. That's after years of experience and knowing exactly what you want to make. You come up with a palette of your own, and every painter is different. There's colors that they like more than others, and they use them. For you, you may just want to get out the ones that you're working on at the time. Just do a couple. If those ones aren't necessarily working, maybe pull out a different blue. If you got to make some yellows, just have a few things out on your palette at once, and always a little white if you know you're going to have to go lighter. Actually, one last thing. Let's do this while I have this in front of me. I got the paint out. Let's see. And so rather than dirtying up the brush, I'm going to go ahead. For that last picture I showed you, the suggested still life that I set up, it was on a yellow ground. It was on a, sort of ochre sheet. That was what the still life was sitting on. So this would be, kind of a no-brainer as far as a color to start on. Because as I work, the color's on top. It's already going to kind of inform me what it's going to look like on top of that yellow sheet. So I'm going to take some of this. Now let's do this one. And so this is wet paint on top of the yellow. Now you can see, I don't have my paintbrush here, so I'm not really controlling the strokes, but you can see this is starting to make the color of what I could use for my red onion. So already, like, you can see how well this looks on top of this yellow. And by thinning it, let's see, wiping it away, I can get lighter versions. And that yellow coming through the paint really makes this, it makes it warmer. It makes it, I don't know, just makes it better, looks better. As opposed to over here, where that purple one spread really thin on top of the white, it looks very cool and kind of lifeless, where this has a lot more warmth to it. I'm just rubbing it around with a paper towel. And then for the deeper parts of the shadow, I could put more thick paint on, kind of mess around like that. And let's say we were going to do the apple, which is much redder. We'll just use Connector in red. Let's see the difference there. What do you think, Kitty? Pretty good? All right. You can see that one. You might be in the way. Sorry. Woo, sorry. And there we got that reddish color there. So that could be, you know, the start of your apple. You know, of course, these are going to be manipulated more, and you're going to add layers to it, and you're going to add whites, and you're going to add highlights and glaze shadows. You know, there's going to be a lot of stuff for you to play with and do. But just in a preliminary sense, you can see already just how those colors look on top of this yellow tone piece.